John Darwin's rhetoric serve as examples of the best that rhetorical criticism has to offer. They've been a huge influence on my own research. So that was my first kairotic encounter with Professor Campbell. My next kairotic encounter with Professor Campbell came during the 1994, or after the 1994-95 academic year, when Professor Campbell helped his colleagues at the University of Washington win a battle to preserve the study of communication here. At the end of that battle, Professor Campbell left UW again, this time for good, accepting a position at the University of Memphis. I think his timing was particularly good because I was an assistant professor by then and was therefore able to step into his position here. Had he not left, I wouldn't be here today. In addition to taking over other duties here, I began directing the public speaking course that Campbell had directed, and then several years later I handed that off to Matt McGarity. I think that that course still carries the imprint that Professor Campbell placed on it when he was here, with a focus on rhetorical education as the key to building a public's capacity for civic engagement. In 2005, Professor Campbell moved again with his spouse, PhD Quigley, this time back to the Puget Sound region, where they took retirement in the Hood Canal area. I say took, because there was nothing passive in their retirement. They rode retirement not to the relaxation that one would expect from an opportunity to become acquainted with leisure time, but instead to new careers as elected public servants in their local community. Now, I think Professor Campbell is going to talk a little bit about that today, so I won't say anything more except to say it's another fortuitous move on his part, kairotic, in that it brought him to us here today. I look forward to seeing what this new work of his, where this new work of his will take my career as I continue to be drawn in the path of his influence. So, thank you.
Nothing like wearing a wire. Very credible. Well, I want to thank Leah for her most generous remarks. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank Professor Kilkowitz and Professor Donkey and the selection committee and for their invitation, and Jessica Herzog for the arrangements that she and her crew have made that made it possible for Brooke and me to be here today. I had a great time this morning in Leah's rhetorical criticism class. That was just wonderful. We had some great conversations, and it was just great to get back into the field, reading these articles and sparking off ideas and developing lines of argument one would never have expected just by looking around the topic. So that was a lot of fun. And it was wonderful at lunch to have lunch with Margot and Lauren. We had some additional conversations talking with Leah's students. And it's good to meet some new colleagues and to see some old ones. My colleague Jerry Phillipson, and of course Tom is here. Blake Emery is here, one of the guys from the old days, out in one of our many alums at Boeing, and one of the people who came forth during the Great War, which I'll have some things to say. My colleague Matt Parks is here, and the lovely Lisa Kuch. So it's great to see these old folks, new colleagues, some old faces. And it's so wonderful to return and to find the department in which I served and love reinvented, secure, and flourishing. I want to acknowledge the unique contributions that Matt McGarity and Leah have made to my distinctive happiness on this occasion. For most of my 28 years, our math is a little different, but 27, 28. For most of my 3 decades on this campus, I did teach Speech 220, and I always regarded that as the fountainhead of the liberal arts and as the essential course for the preparing of citizens for leadership. Matt has taken that course to an enormous audience on platforms I appreciate Matt has taken that to an enormous audience through platforms I would never have imagined, and I am deeply gratified by this achievement. And as for Leah, it's difficult to believe that she was once my student for a semester at Northwestern. Leah has taken the subdiscipline of the rhetoric of science in directions far beyond any contribution of mine. To live to see oneself so far transcended by those for whom one once helped blaze paths, however rude, is to know the grace of a vocation not professed in vain. I'm prepared to depart in peace, but not just yet. For me to be invited to give the Scheidel Lecture is a joyfully humbling experience, very joyfully humbling honor. It was my privilege to be on the faculty of what was then the Department of Speech when Tom Scheidel came to us as chair from the University of Wisconsin. From the very first, Tom's confidence in the importance and permanence of the study of communication on this campus was inspiration. I remember Tom saying on one occasion, if any administrator so much as touches this department, I would personally kneecap him. As one who stood with Tom when the extinction of both departments that professed communication was announced, the pleasure I take in returning to this campus, and particularly to speak from this platform, can scarcely be greater. In inviting me to give the Scheidel Lecture, the selection committee honors all faculty of the former departments of speech communication and the School of Communications, who in the winter of 1994 and 95 stood in solidarity in our moment of danger. I'm really delighted that Tom could be here this afternoon. My theme is a surprising consequence of what I learned of our common profession from my accidental role in our common effort to defend it at that time. The day after we learned that both communications departments had made the dean's blacklist, I was summoned into the speech communication office in Great Hall. A teaching assistant, I think it was one of Tom's, put a phone in. I found myself on KVI talk radio. During the commercial break, Tom emerged from his office, which was nearby, the door to which had been open all this time, and gave me a fact sheet and drew my attention to several points that I'd overlooked. I took it that he was not displeased with my impromptu delivery request, though parts of it had a certain anecdotal cadence. I presumed he wished to resupply the ammunition of my argument and to prevent the engine of my invention from overheating. As an administrator and as a man of prudence, Tom does much of his communication through affirmations. As I attended closely to his premises, I drew the inference that he believed there were numerous other platforms available to us in addition to KVI. But someone would have to know how to find them and know what to do with them once found. Tom never issued me anything so direct as a civic rhetorician's version of what our Constitution calls letters of marque and reprisal. I took it, though, that if personally or through recruits, privateers, or irregulars, I could facilitate the probable public response that would follow from awareness of the facts of our situation, as Aristotle describes in Book 2 of the Rhetoric, in his account of the civic emotions, particularly that most rational of them, anger, and directed to the head of a certain offending deed, you would not take it amiss. Nor, in any event, I was made to understand, nor would I be wanting for fresh copy or access to a fax machine. Thus began my public practice of the art which up until then I had practiced in scholarly publications, in the classroom, and after I had ascertained sternness, the occasional tabletop. In his dialogue, Protagoras, Socrates tells the young Hippocrates that it is well and good to study communication as part of a general education, but to study it under a professional rhetorician is to risk becoming a certain kind of person. It was for the student. Of course, we all are concerned with the students. This afternoon, I would like to explore the risks and potential consequences of professing communication of the professor. As the first technology of mass communication, rhetoric, to take the most ancient name for our profession, was rooted in the thought of the Greek. When it functions well, the discipline has always advanced popular governance. But studying communication, particularly in the context of the modern research university, makes the professor a member of a learned elite and gives him or her a separate allegiance to professional peers over against popular opinions or forms of government. To mediate between popular and learned opinion, to carry a brief both for the many and for the few, itself requires special understanding and rhetorical skill. Seen in this light, the development of the rhetoric of science is hardly surprising. One can only wonder why it took so long. Colleagues who criticized those of us who appealed to the public to stave the study of communication on this campus had a point: to urge the public to interfere in the internal affairs of the university, even in a good cause, sets a bad precedent. Our response was that to allow an unelected elite to eliminate from the academy, particularly from the state's premier university, disciplines central to the study and practice of the arts that have created and sustained always an informed electorate and representative government is worse. I'm not arguing that the ends justify the means. My point is theoretical. To profess communication is not just to think about these questions abstractly. To profess communication is to commit oneself to a way of life and to reconcile the tension between theory and practice, principle and pragmatism, through weighing the circumstances of the particular case in which these issues arise and which call for judgment and timely action. Edmund Burke, who knew both political science and persuasion, described the statesman as the philosopher in action. And of course, another word for statesman is politician. And another word for politician is democrat. But why surrender to the despisers of popular government, a useful descriptive term, when they themselves practice what they accuse us of, when they substitute pandering to popular opinion for the proper meaning of the term? Who is here so proud that he would not lead the demos? If any, speak, for him or her have I offended. Preparing citizens to lead is what we in communications do. And given our list of graduates, from which could be called a who's who of business, technology, entrepreneurship, politics, and the helping professions in Puget Sound, I think we're pretty good at it too. And I'm very happy that that is much better understood on this campus these days than it was a decade or so ago. But our pedagogy carries an implication we rarely discuss. If the tale I'm about to share with you concerning my recent research is appropriately cautionary, it will have achieved its purpose. A funny thing happened to me on the way to return. Hood Canal is an ideal habitat for a recovering academic. It's beautiful. It's quiet. You can watch the birds, see eagles and cormorants fish. You can fish yourself. You can dig clams, harvest oysters, and if you know how to identify them, you can find chanterelle mushrooms. You can hike, kayak, and with a wetsuit, you can swim year-round. At the southern end of Hood Canal in Belfair, Washington, where Brooke and I live, there is a little-known environmental jewel called the Feller Wetlands. The land was deeded to the North Mason School District by the will of a local grocer, Sam Feller. Thanks to a series of partnerships between the Pacific Northwest Salmon Center, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Ecology, and the North Mason School District, a trail goes through that wetland and loops back past the science classroom. That classroom and the attached museum were once headquarters of the Hood Canal Institute, the brainchild of Karen Libby. Karen was and is a science educator of exceptional talent. She was Washington State Science Teacher of the Year. Norm Dix, Patty Murray, Christine Gregoire have all walked the Feller trails and seen her work, and they have seen her students at it. Starting with a bare-bones curriculum in the early 1980s, within a decade, Karen had transformed the North Mason science curriculum into a model for science educators and students throughout the state and throughout the region. Karen's genius was to use project-centered science to motivate kids to do hard things. She got them to master the math necessary to measure patterns of erosion in forest lands. And her kids changed the practices, the models for the Forest Service in Washington State. She got them to master the chemistry needed to measure water quality. When I retired, Brooke and I were shocked to read that the Hood Canal Institute had been effectively canceled as a result of actions of the local school board. Apparently, some people in Belfair thought that a better use of the wetlands would be as a ball field. This was during a time when a wetland was just another soggy piece of real estate asking for a backfill. In bringing in new people, new programs, and new ideas, Karen unintentionally threatened traditional networks. Those of us familiar with the operation of universities should not be surprised that a valuable educational program might fall victim to the politics of a small town. Not long after Brooke and I moved to Belfair, we were asked to give a public seminar. Our theme was civic communication. It was well attended, and we were asked to give another one. In 2007, the year I no longer returned to Tennessee to teach a yearly seminar, various individuals approached me and asked me if I would run for school board. What was my responsibility? As far as I was concerned, after 40 years of institutionalization, I had paid my debt to society. Brooke and I had given our local community a seminar. My obligation was to the community of scholars and to my unfinished academic. The head of the local mortgage company wanted me to accompany him to a local school. I told him straight out, I'm not a Republican. He said he wanted me to come anyway. What I saw confirmed what I'd heard. Under cover of criticizing the teachers' union, and at the time there was no bargaining issue between the board and the school. The board chair and his two reliable associates were treating both teachers and administrators with disrespect, with the evident approval of their followers, who, by their gestures and demeanors, filled the first two rows of the boardroom where the deliberations occurred. Now, when administrators and teachers, often on opposite sides of the bargaining table, are united, the two votes of no confidence given by the North Mason Educational Association had to be taken as a symptom that something in local school board governance was seriously amiss. After the meeting, several parents and teachers approached me. As I listened, it was as though a Socratic dame with a wicked sense of irony was trying to tell me something. At the University of Washington, I had appealed to the people when an unelected elite had threatened to abolish departments which taught and studied the arts central to active citizenship, a free and inquisitive press, and representative government. And now, a malignant populism was threatening the integrity of expertise in the public schools of my community. I've taught my students that the inventional challenge of a civic rhetorician is to find cures for the distempers of the polis within the disease. But to find the cure in this case, it appeared, I would have to run for it. Fortunately for me and for the North Mason community, there were two other reform candidates. 3 seats were open. One was held by the chair, in whose district I lived. Another open seat was held by Art Whiteman, the one independent on the old board. Art had a daughter in the high school who was director of the local Girl Scout camp, and he and his family lived at that camp deep in the Tahuya forest. Art was an outspoken critic of the chair, and I knew from the news stories I'd read before I met him, a man of unshakable courage. Art's opponent, a local salesperson, had an attitude toward teachers so toxic it ought to embarrass the faction with which he was aligned. The third seat was contested by Laura Bode. Laura had graduated from the North Mason schools, as had her husband Butch, as had their daughters, and as had their son Lee. Laura resigned from a job she loved and had long held as an assistant to the much beloved superintendent, the late Tom Keller. Her son Lee had been inspired by Karen to become an environmental scientist, and he had his own consultant. Laura lived in the district of the chair's right-hand man, despite the many connections between them. Coincident with living in a small town and with no personal animosity, Laura felt obliged to oppose him. For the most part, we campaigned separately, but everyone knew we were a team. My campaign slogan was trust, leadership, and communication. To minimize dividing the community further by my campaign, I adopted a simple expedient. I would not criticize my opponent. The signature of my campaign, in addition to my signs, which I thought were attractive, large, and everywhere, was doorbell. Aside from Lakeland Village and a few other places, doors are few and far between in North Mason. My district is intersected by Hood Canal and North Bay, the end of Puget Sound. Many houses are strung out along the water or deep in the woods where it's hard to find them, and the people who live there like it. Ask Brooke, she worked for the census. She has been to doors that would cause even me pause. And I heard my way through college in Southern Mass. Yes, I speak dog, but I'm getting thrown somewhere. Few politicians in our area doorbell, and none had ever done so in a school board race. When someone would answer a door, I would say, "Hi, I'm John Campbell. I'm running for school board." And I would slip them my brochure. And then, taking something I'd learned from British public address, I would say, "If you like things the way they are, vote for my honorable opponent. If you need a change, I remain." I doorbelled relentlessly. I became such a fixture in the Safeway parking lot, passing out my brochures and offering to return empty grocery carts to their racks that one gentleman asked if this were not where I lived. The week before the vote, Brooke and I anted up a couple $100 more for some distinctive banners to keep in reserve just in case. At the victory party, we learned that the reform ticket had prevailed. Each of us had bested our opponent by a margin of 3,000 votes out of 5,000 cast in the race. After the party, Brooke and I disappeared into the November evening and diagonally across each of our billboards patched our new "Thank You Voters" signs. And on the way to the shipyards or to jobs in Tacoma and Olympia, that's the first thing that our voters saw in the morning. On that note, my colleagues and I, with the support of a fourth board member, their file on our board, this fellow had seen the light, began governing. What had befallen the North Mason School District was not that unusual. Something similar recently happened in Marysville. The whole scenario is straight out of Madison's Federalist No. 10. At any time, a faction can take over local government. But as a refinement on Madison, our experience suggests that even local, a faction may be a minority. The sole success of our local faction lay in deceiving themselves and sometimes in intimidating others to believe that they spoke for the community. Music requires not only notes, but the intervals between them. One of the sweetest democratic sounds I've ever heard is the silence from our opposition's camp. By noon of the day after the election returns were in, their signs disappeared as they had mentioned. But our opponents were not enemies, but civic friends. Their overreach had exposed a structural flaw in the way the school board related to itself, the superintendent, to the staff, and to the teachers. Some future faction might exploit this flaw, or we ourselves might overreach. Our lease on wisdom also might be of all too short a date. So how are we to affirm and protect popular oversight of the schools, while at the same time establishing a climate where professionalism and excellence in teaching and administrating could flourish? Why is it that so many profound questions have to do with the reconciliation of opposites, those things for which there can be no precise science, and which have always been the province of professors of communication and the disciplines aligned with them? That is, as you recognize, a rhetorical question. But I mean it in a more profound sense than we ordinarily think. In addressing this question, we had an ally in the new superintendent, David Peterson. David was the last best gift of the old board. When the previous superintendent had resigned, David applied for his position. The other 4 applicants withdrew. David also was advised by his peers that to accept the superintendency of the North Mason district would be to commit professional suicide. David had strong credentials and, though he'd never previously been a superintendent, had an equally strong sense of adventure. The old board hired him, I suppose, to save face. David managed the schools and his managers for a semester. After the election, the new superintendent and his new board had a mandate for change. David taught us about policy governance. Under policy governance, a school board develops 4 sets of policies: ends, executive requirements, board superintendent relationships, and governance process. I will not here elaborate. I would summarize the relationship of a board to its organization under policy governance in these terms: nose is in, hands off. To me, policy governance seemed the needed vaccination against a populist discipline. Under policy governance, David shares the responsibility we entrust to him with the administrators under him. Teachers similarly assume responsibility for performance, and they collaborate in improving student learning. How successful have we been? We have miles to go, but I can tell you this. The North Mason School District is the model for Washington State in teacher evaluation. And we did that not with the opposition, but with the support of our union. Similarly, we are one of the models for principal evaluation in Washington State. Establishing a climate of professionalism and trust within the schools is not sufficient to make the foundation for professionalism and expertise secure. To secure a culture, to sustain a culture where professionalism and expertise are honored, one must simultaneously appeal to the people whose suspicion of expertise and the potential aloofness of experts can be the source of the problem. When my colleagues and I took office, our buildings were depleted. The district had not passed a bond in 30 years. When all appropriate consulting work was done, we were looking at $58 million. Many of my supporters in the business community recognized the problem, but were proposing absurdly low figures to address it. The superintendent told me in a personal conversation after I'd been taken to the woodshed by several of my supporters that anything below $35 million would be a waste of taxpayer money and wouldn't even benefit the students. How do you get people to raise their taxes? How do you deal with a necessary partner, the business community, who read their enlightened self-interest very differently than do you? What do you say to ordinary voters, working people struggling to get it? My colleagues and I said this: we're not the owners of the schools. You are. As your trustee, it is our responsibility to tell you the truth about your assets. Having consulted with you and with the appropriate stakeholders and with experienced school architects and planners, here's the need, here's the plan, and here's the cost. 2009 was not a good year for the bond. It takes a super majority to pass one. We worked hard and convinced almost half the community to support us. But 48% is far short of the necessary super majority of 60%. In the long run, our failing campaign was a kind of victory. At the beginning of our campaign, an informal poll that we did showed that about 80% of the people in North Mason thought the schools were in fine shape. At the end of our campaign, only 15% thought that. Immediately after the failure of the bond, we went back to the people for a $3.9 million capital plan. Our message was simple: we heard you, we understand. You know the condition of your assets. We need $3.9 million just to hold things together and fix the existing problems. We got it. After the passage of the capital levy, the superintendent and our board emphasized that the schools were striving for excellence, no matter what. Raising the quality of education is what we aimed for, and we communicated our challenges and our progress. Early in his tenure, David had hired a skilled tech person to develop and diversify our website. Without even trying, without even entering, we were judged third best in the nation in our class for our website. In addition, each month we bought a page in the North Mason Life, a publication of the Kitsap Sun. Part of our page included a letter from the board. Each of us, in our own name, would describe an activity we participated in, a program that we had attended or wanted people to know about. My colleagues and I became circuit writers. Each month, one or another of us attended the service clubs, the Chamber of Commerce, the Allen Communication, the Allen Community Association. I had an appointment there tomorrow morning. I have a colleague that's going to be subbing for me. We're still doing this. The Victor Improvement Club. A lot of what I do, Mr. is just show. We asked questions of our audiences, we answered them, and we made announcements. The civic climate of North Mason began to change. School board meetings were no longer news. You can't guarantee that there'll even be a reporter there. The culture of divisiveness had been virtually erased. David's team, working closely with the teachers, was improving education. We were fiscally prudent and efficient. We saved water, we saved paper, we saved electricity. And we went from 2 meetings a month to 1. During my first campaign, my slogan was trust, leadership, and communication. During my second, I told people I had brought them 4 years of progress and good government and order, all at reasonable cost. But I did not campaign the second time, neither did any of my colleagues. All of us ran unopposed. 3 years after the failure of our first bond, David thought it was time to try another. Our board was not sure, but in addition to having a financially more favorable climate, our $3.9 million capital levy advanced our long-term plan. With certain design changes and changes in prices, we could run a bond for $49 million. After deliberation, our board saved us. The result took us all by surprise. Last week, there were 12 bonds on the ballot in Washington State, all of them failed. We passed our bond by just a few points short of 62%. How did that happen? In addition to the differences in economic climate between 2009 and 2012, I think our board, our superintendent, and the young leadership that we had recruited from the PTAs and community created its own base, stronger than the base of any faction and independent of traditional sources of power, including the business community, even though they supported us. Over a period of 5 years, through print, internet, through improvements of education, and by showing them the established trust, we showed leadership, and we knew relentless. We've not achieved all we would like. Karen's visionary science program with its network of partnerships has not been restored. Karen Levy herself has moved on to a challenging new job with the Educational Service District. On the other hand, they're promising developments. In April of 2008, the Department of Fish and Wildlife purchased 52 acres of what had been the Johnson Farm. This is adjacent to Feller Trails. In January of 2009, the Hood Canal Salmon Center acquired the Johnson House, barn, outbuildings, and an additional 38 acres of their land, in spite of die-hard opposition from a member of the board. Fish and Wildlife last summer reached the dikes on the land it had purchased. My last column for the North Mason Life described the partnership between fisheries biologists at the Salmon Center, Dave Kangasser, and Matt Lomsdale, who teaches biology at North Mason High School. Periodically, at low tide, you can find math students making their way through the mud, counting and classifying the forms of marine life, returning to what last year at this time was a passage. Math students are not just studying science, they're contributing to it. Their data and the data of their successors will be part of the scientific record of how a saltwater marsh evolves. Matt would be pleased if some of his students became environmental science, as did my colleague Laura's son Lee. But like Karen, Matt knows he has a larger objective: to create a generation of citizen scientists who know how nature works, how humans interact with it, and who will support or initiate the public policies necessary for each to flourish. Earlier this year, the chair of the Salmon Center, Mindy Harlow, invited my colleagues and me to attend the reopening of the Feller Trails after the breaching of the dikes and the subsequent reconstruction. I gave a short speech, I actually can. Art and Laura and I were given a huge golden pair of scissors. We cut the ribbon reopening the trails that now cross 2 elevated walkways spanning the places, the spaces where the dikes once stood. I hope you'll come to Feller, Belfair, and walk those trails. I'd be glad to walk the route. As Socrates warned, our profession is fraught with implications for public understanding and for self-understanding. Like Plato's contemplative philosopher, a professor of communication also seeks autonomy and the examined life. But rather than finding these in foundational certainties, she invents them through stable innovation, through finding in the conventions and circumstances of her communities the values, paths for timely change, and the language to motivate their realization. Whether as an academic in studying the chemistries and cross-currents of the waters, or specialized knowledge and popular thought commingled, or as an activist in navigating the civic estuary formed at their juncture, the professor of communication in either role may find herself becoming androgynous. Rhetoric, it seems, is anything but superficial. To profess it, one must risk becoming, as Kenneth Burke might have put it, consubstantial, both with one's audiences and with one's environment. To profess communication, one must have principle and character, yet be willing to adapt. One must be comfortable with ambiguity, not easily intimidated or overly impressed with oneself. One must be serene in chaos, attentive to kairos, and prepared to respond to fortune with invention, a sense of humor, and what a certain Italian theorist called virtù. I thank you for your attention.